When my sister Cordelia called me screaming at 6 in the morning, I bolted upright in bed thinking someone had died. Her voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand her through the phone. "You need to get over here right now," she kept repeating. "I found something. Oh my God, I found something. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from?" If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. I threw on yesterday's clothes and drove the 20 minutes to her house in complete panic. Cordelia never screams. She's the calm one in our family, the librarian who speaks in whispers and thinks through every decision twice before acting. When I pulled into her driveway, she was standing in her backyard holding something metallic in her dirt-covered hands, tears streaming down her face. "What is that?" I asked, walking toward the gaping hole she'd apparently been digging in Grandmother Zelda's old rose garden. She looked up at me with this expression I'd never seen before, somewhere between terror and amazement. "I think it's proof that everything we thought we knew about Grandma Zelda was a lie." That was the moment our quiet family life in Millfield, Ohio became a national news story. What Cordelia unearthed that morning would bring FBI agents to our doorstep, historians from around the world to our small town, and reporters camping outside her house for weeks. But more than that, it would reveal that our sweet grandmother who taught us to garden and bake cookies had been hiding the most incredible secret any of us could have imagined. This is the story of how a simple backyard renovation project turned my careful rule-following sister into the most talked-about person in America. It's about discovering that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes are hiding in plain sight, tending their gardens and living quiet lives while carrying the weight of having saved dozens of strangers' lives decades ago. Before I tell you what she found buried 4 feet beneath those prize-winning roses, you need to understand who Cordelia was before that morning. Because the woman standing in that hole, holding evidence of our family's hidden past, was not the same person who had called a contractor 3 days earlier to help expand her flower bed. What she discovered didn't just change our understanding of Grandmother Zelda. It changed Cordelia completely, and honestly, it changed all of us. To understand what happened that morning, you need to know who Cordelia was before she became the woman holding mysterious metal objects in her backyard. My sister has always been the steady one in our family. At 34, she's 2 years older than me and has spent her entire adult life as the head librarian in our small town of Millfield, Ohio. She's the person people come to when they need help finding the perfect book for their teenager or researching their family genealogy. She speaks softly, thinks before she acts, and has never done anything remotely impulsive in her entire life. That careful nature served her well until 8 months ago when her husband of 8 years decided he wanted a different life and moved to California with his secretary. The divorce hit Cordelia harder than she let anyone see. She'd built her whole world around routine and stability, and suddenly half of that world just walked away. Our grandmother Zelda had passed away the year before, leaving Cordelia the house she'd lived in since 1943. It's a beautiful 1940s colonial on Elm Street with white clapboard siding and green shutters, sitting on nearly an acre of land that backs up to the old woods outside town. Zelda had been famous throughout Millfield for her gardens, especially her roses that won prizes at the county fair every year for over 3 decades. After the divorce, Cordelia threw herself into restoring that house like her life depended on it. She spent weekends stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and learning how to maintain the extensive gardens that had been Zelda's pride and joy. Our parents, Vivian and Thomas, lived 3 hours away in Columbus and worried constantly about her living alone in that big house, but Cordelia insisted she was fine. She said working with her hands helped her think, and tending Zelda's gardens made her feel connected to something larger than her own problems. The property itself tells a story. Zelda had transformed nearly half an acre into garden spaces over the 40 years she lived there. There are stone pathways she laid herself, a small potting shed painted the same green as the house shutters, and raised beds that still produce vegetables every summer. But the crown jewel was always the rose garden along the back fence. Dozens of varieties bloomed from early spring through late fall, creating this incredible wall of color and fragrance that you could smell from the street. The soil back there is special, Zelda used to tell us when we were kids helping her water and weed. She'd have this mysterious little smile when she said it, like she was sharing a secret. We always assumed she meant she'd found the perfect fertilizer or had some gardening trick she'd learned over the years. Zelda never talked much about her life before she married our grandfather in 1943. She always said her family died in a house fire back east and that she came to Ohio to start fresh. We never questioned it. What we didn't know then was that our quiet neighborhood had its own mysterious history. The house Zelda bought in 1943 had belonged to a man named Henrik Larsson, a reclusive immigrant who had simply vanished in 1962. No forwarding address, no family to claim his belongings. The rumors around town were that he'd been involved in something during the war, but nobody ever said what. Mrs. Prentice, the elderly woman who worked part-time at the library doing local history research, once mentioned to Cordelia that this part of town had secrets buried deeper than most people realized, but she never elaborated. Over the past few months, as Cordelia worked in those gardens, she'd been finding odd things. Small metal fragments that looked corroded and old, pieces of what might have been jewelry or hardware. She assumed they were just remnants of old garden tools or decorative elements that had broken down over the years. Zelda had lived there for nearly 60 years after all. Gardens accumulate a lot of debris over that kind of time. But there was something about that back corner of the rose garden that had always felt different. The roses there grew more vigorously than anywhere else on the property. The soil was darker, richer somehow. Zelda had always been vague about why that particular section was so fertile, just smiling and saying the earth there was well fed. 3 weeks before that morning phone call, Cordelia had made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. She wanted to expand the rose garden as a memorial to Zelda, creating something beautiful that would honor our grandmother's legacy. She hired Dane Morrison, a local contractor who'd helped several neighbors with landscaping projects, to help with the heavy digging and design work. It was supposed to be simple. Expand the existing bed by about 10 feet, install some new trellises, and plant additional varieties of roses that Zelda had always talked about wanting to try. Cordelia had spent hours at the library researching heritage roses, planning the layout, choosing colors that would complement what was already there. She was excited about the project in a way I hadn't seen her excited about anything since before the divorce. The work was scheduled to begin on a Tuesday morning in early September. The weather had been perfect, clear and cool, ideal for digging and planting. Cordelia had taken 3 days off from the library, something she almost never did, because she wanted to be there for every step of the process. She told me she was looking forward to getting her hands dirty, to creating something beautiful where she could go to remember Zelda and think about the future she was building for herself. None of us could have predicted that instead of planting roses, she'd be unearthing evidence of a story that would change everything we thought we knew about our family and capture the attention of the entire country. The conflict, rising tension, the inciting incident. Cordelia decides to expand Zelda's rose garden as a memorial project. She hires a local contractor, Dane Morrison, to help with the heavy digging and landscape design. Growing mystery. During the first day of digging, they hit something hard about 3 feet down. Initially thinking it's a large rock or old septic system, they continue excavating. The object appears to be metal, rectangular, and deliberately buried. Escalating discoveries. The metal object is clearly man-made, resembling a large box or container. Cordelia finds corroded metal fragments with markings that look like numbers or letters. Dane becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Suggesting they call someone official, Cordelia discovers a leather pouch containing old photographs and documents wrapped in oilcloth. Internal conflict. Cordelia faces a dilemma between her natural caution, call authorities immediately, and burning curiosity. Investigate privately first. Her recent divorce has left her craving independence and control over her own decisions. External pressures. Dane threatens to leave the job if they don't report the find. Neighbor Mrs. Chen starts asking questions about all the digging. The documents appear to contain names and dates from the 1940s and 1950s, rising emotional stakes. Cordelia called me that first evening, and I could hear something in her voice I'd never heard before. Not excitement exactly, but this intense focus, like she'd found a puzzle she absolutely had to solve. She said, "I think Grandma Zelda kept a secret from us. A big one. The point of no return." When Cordelia opens the leather pouch and sees photographs of people she doesn't recognize alongside documents with her grandmother's maiden name, she realizes this isn't just random buried treasure. This is personal family history that someone deliberately hid. The turning point, decision or action taken. Cordelia's decision. Instead of immediately calling authorities, she decides to document everything herself first and contact our family historian, Uncle Wesley, who lives in Detroit. She wants to understand what this means for our family before it becomes public. Preparation. Phase. Cordelia carefully photographs every item before fully excavating. She calls in sick to the library for 3 days straight, unprecedented for her. She swears Dane to secrecy with a bonus payment for his discretion. She sets up a makeshift workspace in Zelda's basement to examine everything properly, research process. Uncle Wesley arrives with genealogy records and old family photos. They discover the photographs match people in Wesley's research who mysteriously disappeared from family records around 1943. The documents include what appear to be forged identification papers and travel permits. Key discovery. Among the papers, they find a letter in Grandmother Zelda's handwriting, dated 1962, explaining that she was keeping them safe until it was time for the truth. Family revelation. Uncle Wesley reveals that Zelda never spoke about her life before marrying our grandfather in 1943. She claimed her family died in a house fire, but there were never any official records found. The decision to dig deeper. When Wesley showed us a photograph from the buried collection next to one from his genealogy research, Cordelia went completely silent. Then she looked at me and said, "We're not just digging up the garden anymore. We're digging up Zelda's entire past." That's when she made the decision that changed everything. Preparation for the big reveal. Cordelia decides to excavate the entire area methodically, documenting everything like an archaeological dig. She purchases proper tools, creates detailed maps, and prepares to uncover whatever else Zelda buried beneath that rose garden. Final setup. By the third day, Cordelia had transformed from my careful librarian sister into something I'd never seen before. She was determined, fearless, and absolutely convinced that whatever Zelda hid was something the world needed to know about. The climax. Big reveal. That Tuesday morning started like any other renovation project. Dane Morrison arrived at 7:30 with his truck full of shovels, pickaxes, and a small rototiller. He's a good guy, mid-40s, been doing landscaping around Millfield for over 15 years. Cordelia had coffee ready and the area marked out with spray paint where she wanted the new section of the rose garden to extend. The plan was straightforward. They'd remove the existing grass and weeds, dig down about 18 inches to prepare the soil, then build up the bed with compost and topsoil before planting. Cordelia had researched everything meticulously, as always. She knew exactly which varieties of heritage roses she wanted, where each would go, and how the new section would complement Zelda's original design. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The morning was cool and overcast, perfect digging weather. Dane worked methodically while Cordelia pulled weeds and prepared the compost she'd been building all summer. They chatted about the different rose varieties, about how impressive Zelda's garden had always been, about Cordelia's plans to maybe add a small memorial bench near the back corner. Then, around 9:15, Dane's shovel hit something hard. "Probably a rock," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Your grandmother might have buried some stones back here for drainage." But when they cleared away more soil, it wasn't a rock. It was something rectangular and metallic, about the size of a large book. The edges were corroded and stained, but it was clearly man-made. Dane knelt down and brushed more dirt away, frowning. "This doesn't look like any drainage system I've seen," he said. "Cordelia, come look at this." She knelt beside him and ran her fingers along the edge of whatever they'd uncovered. The metal felt thick, substantial, like it had been built to last. But it was also obviously old. Very old. "Should we keep digging around it?" she asked. Dane hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe we should call someone. This could be an old septic tank or utility line. We don't want to damage anything important." But Cordelia was already reaching for the hand trowel, carefully scraping soil away from the edges of the object. There was something about the way it was positioned that didn't seem random. It was buried deliberately, placed there with intention. "Look at this," she said, pointing to what appeared to be markings on the surface. "These look like numbers, or maybe letters. They're too corroded to read clearly, but someone put these here on purpose." As they continued digging, the object revealed itself to be some kind of metal container, roughly the size of a large shoebox. The metal was heavily tarnished, green, and black with age, but still intact. Whatever it was, it had been sealed and buried with care. Dane was getting increasingly uncomfortable. "Cordelia, I really think we should stop and call someone official. This could be anything. What if it's hazardous materials or something from the war? This area has a lot of history we don't know about." But Cordelia was completely absorbed now. She'd found 3 more metal fragments nearby, smaller pieces that looked like they might have once been part of something larger. Her librarian instincts were kicking in. This wasn't random debris. This was evidence of something, a mystery that needed solving. "Just help me get it out," she said. "We don't have to open it, but I want to see what else is down here." They worked together to carefully excavate the container. It was heavier than expected, and there was something that rattled inside when they lifted it. As they set it aside on the grass, Cordelia noticed something else in the hole they'd created. A corner of what looked like fabric, dark and rotted, but clearly not natural to the soil. "There's more," she said, reaching for the fabric. What she pulled up made both of them go silent. It was the remains of a leather pouch, cracked and stained, but still recognizable. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were photographs. Old black and white photographs of people they didn't recognize, and documents covered in handwriting that was faded but still partially legible. Dane stood up and stepped back. "That's it. I'm done. Cordelia, this is way beyond landscaping. We need to call the police or the Historical Society or someone. We could be disturbing a crime scene or destroying important historical artifacts." But Cordelia was transfixed by the photographs. Even damaged by time and moisture, she could see faces clearly. A young couple with a small child, an elderly man in a formal suit, a woman about her own age holding what appeared to be official documents. "These people," she said quietly. "I feel like I should know them." She looked more closely at the documents. The handwriting was in multiple languages, some of it English, some in what might have been German or another European language. But what caught her attention were the dates: 1943, 1944, 1945. And then she saw something that made her heart stop. At the bottom of one of the documents, in handwriting she'd seen thousands of times in birthday cards and recipe notes, was a signature: Zelda Morrison. Not Zelda Westbrook, the name she'd used after marrying our grandfather, her maiden name, the name she'd never talked about from the life she'd never discussed. "Dane," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to leave." "What?" "I need you to go home. Don't talk to anyone about this. Please. I'll pay you for the full day, but I need to figure out what this means before anyone else gets involved." She looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen before, intense and determined and slightly desperate. "My grandmother buried these things for a reason. Before I let strangers dig through her secrets, I need to understand what she was protecting." Dane gathered his tools reluctantly. "Cordelia, I don't think this is a good idea. You're talking about withholding potential evidence of something. What if this is connected to that man who disappeared, Henrik whatever his name was?" "Henrik Larsson," she said automatically, and then stopped. How did she know his full name? Mrs. Prentice had only mentioned Henrik once, months ago. After Dane left, Cordelia sat in her backyard staring at the metal container and the photographs spread on an old towel. The rational part of her mind, the librarian part that followed. Rules and procedures knew she should call the authorities immediately. But the granddaughter part, the part that had loved Zelda more than anyone else in the world, needed to understand what these secrets meant before she shared them with strangers. She looked at the roses blooming all around her, their roots growing in soil that had hidden these mysteries for decades, and realized that everything she thought she knew about her family was about to change. Cordelia's decision. Instead of immediately calling authorities, she decides to document everything herself first and contact our family historian, Uncle Wesley, who lives in Detroit. She wants to understand what this means for our family before it becomes public. Preparation phase. Cordelia carefully photographs every item before fully excavating. She calls in sick to the library for 3 days straight, unprecedented for her. She swears Dane to secrecy with a bonus payment for his discretion. She sets up a makeshift workspace in Zelda's basement to examine everything properly. Research process. Uncle Wesley arrives with genealogy records and old family photos. They discover the photographs match people in Wesley's research who mysteriously disappeared from family records around 1943. The documents include what appear to be forged identification papers and travel permits. Key discovery. Among the papers, they find a letter in grandmother Zelda's handwriting dated 1962, explaining that she was keeping them safe until it was time for the truth. Family revelation. Uncle Wesley reveals that Zelda never spoke about her life before marrying our grandfather in 1943. She claimed her family died in a house fire, but there were never any official records found. The decision to dig deeper. When Wesley showed us a photograph from the buried collection next to one from his genealogy research, Cordelia went completely silent. Then she looked at me and said, "We're not just digging up the garden anymore. We're digging up Zelda's entire past." That's when she made the decision that changed everything. Preparation for the big reveal. Cordelia decides to excavate the entire area methodically, documenting everything like an archaeological dig. She purchases proper tools, creates detailed maps, and prepares to uncover whatever else Zelda buried beneath that rose garden. Final setup. By the third day, Cordelia had transformed from my careful librarian sister into something I'd never seen before. She was determined, fearless, and absolutely convinced that whatever Zelda hid was something the world needed to know about. By Friday morning, Cordelia had transformed her grandmother's basement into something that looked like an archaeological dig site. She'd purchased proper brushes, magnifying glasses, and archival storage materials from the university supply store in Columbus. Uncle Wesley had driven down from Detroit with boxes of genealogy research and old family photographs. Together, they'd spent 2 days carefully documenting everything they'd found, photographing each item from multiple angles, creating detailed maps of where everything had been buried. But it was what they discovered on that 5th day of digging that changed everything. 4 feet down, beneath the metal container and leather pouch, Cordelia's careful excavation revealed something much larger. A wooden crate, roughly the size of a hope chest, wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth and plastic sheeting. Even after decades in the ground, the waterproofing had held. When they carefully lifted it out of the earth, they could hear items shifting inside. "This is it," Wesley said quietly, looking at the crate. This is what she was really hiding. Cordelia's hands were shaking as she worked to open the latches. The metal hardware was corroded but still functional. When the lid finally lifted, both of us just stared in complete silence at what was inside. The crate contained over 200 personal items, each one carefully wrapped in cloth or paper, jewelry that clearly belonged to different families, photographs of children, wedding pictures, family portraits, documents in multiple languages, many of them bearing official stamps and seals, religious artifacts including several ornate menorahs, prayer books, and ceremonial items. Handwritten letters tied with ribbon, some in English, others in German, Hebrew, and languages we couldn't identify. But it was the diary that broke us both. Wrapped in a piece of blue silk was a leather-bound journal written in English by someone named Ruth Goldberg. The entries were dated 1943, and as Cordelia read the first page aloud, we began to understand the magnitude of what Zelda had been hiding. May 15th, 1943. The American woman, Zelda, says, "We are safe here, but I cannot stop," listening for footsteps on the porch. She has given us the upstairs room with the yellow wallpaper and told little Anna she can help tend the roses. Anna smiles for the first time since we left Germany. Zelda says the roses help her remember that beautiful things can grow even in dark soil. Ruth's diary documented 6 months of living in Zelda's house, along with her daughter Anna and Ruth's elderly father Samuel. She wrote about other families who had passed through, staying for weeks or months before moving on to permanent safety. She described Zelda as someone who risked everything to help strangers, who taught frightened children to plant seeds and tend gardens as a way to hope for the future. June 3rd, 1943. Another family arrived last night. Zelda never tells us their real names, says it's safer for everyone that way, but she makes sure each family leaves something behind, some small piece of who they really are, so that if anything happens to them in their new lives, there will be proof they existed, proof of who they were before they had to become someone else. Wesley found documentation showing that Zelda had helped at least 30 people escape persecution between 1942 and 1945. She kept meticulous records of their true identities, their stories, their destinations, all buried safely in her backyard, in case they ever needed proof of who they really were. At the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in a piece of her own wedding dress fabric, was a letter addressed to my future grandchildren. Zelda had written it in 1962, the year Henrik Larsson disappeared. The year she decided it was time to bury all the evidence permanently. "My dear ones," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I could never tell you while I was alive. I was part of a network of people who helped families escape the terrible things happening in Europe during the war. I could not save everyone, but I saved who I could. Henrik Larsson, the man who owned this house, before me was part of our group. When the war ended and it became dangerous for those of us who had helped, he gave me this house and these belongings and disappeared to protect all of us. I have kept these families' memories safe in the place where they found safety, under the roses that they helped me plant. Roses that bloom every year as a reminder that love and courage can survive the darkest times." The letter went on to explain that each item in the crate represented a family she had helped, people who had trusted her with their lives and their true identities. She had promised them that their stories would be preserved, that even if they had to live the rest of their lives as someone else, somewhere there would be a record of who they really were. Ruth's final diary entry, dated November 20th, 1943, was barely legible through our tears. "We leave tomorrow for our new life in Canada. Anna picked roses from Zelda's garden to press in this diary so she will always remember the place where we learned to hope again. Zelda says the roses will keep growing long after we're gone, and that someday, when the world is safe again, people will know what happened here. She says love planted in good soil never truly dies. It just waits for the right season to bloom again." When Cordelia finished reading, she looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "All those years," she said. "All those years we thought Grandma just loved gardening. She wasn't just growing roses. She was growing hope on top of the place where she'd hidden the most precious things these families owned." We sat there in that basement surrounded by the belongings of people who had trusted their most treasured possessions to a young woman they'd known for just a few months. Zelda had spent the rest of her life as the guardian of their memories, tending roses that bloomed above their buried stories, keeping their secrets safe until someone came along who would know what to do with them. That afternoon, Cordelia made the call to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. She knew that these families' stories, these carefully preserved pieces of their identities, needed to be shared with the world. Within hours, historians were on their way to Millfield, and by the next morning, our quiet town was about to become the center of one of the most significant Holocaust resistance discoveries in decades. Within 48 hours of Cordelia's call to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, our quiet street in Millfield looked like a scene from a movie. News vans lined both sides of Elm Street, Reporters set up camp on the sidewalk across from Zelda's house, and historians from 3 different universities were working in shifts to catalog and authenticate every item from the buried crate. The story went viral faster than any of us could have imagined. Small-town librarian uncovers hidden Holocaust hero was trending on social media by Sunday morning. Major news networks wanted interviews. Documentary filmmakers were calling. The phone rang so constantly that Cordelia finally just unplugged it and relied on her cell phone for essential calls only. But the media attention, overwhelming as it was, wasn't the most remarkable part of what happened next. It was the letters. Hundreds of them, from all over the world, started arriving within the first week. The first one came from Montreal, Canada. It was from a woman named Anna Hoffman, 83 years old, who had seen the news coverage and recognized her mother's handwriting in the photographs of Ruth's diary. Anna was the little girl Ruth had written about, the child who had helped Zelda tend the roses in 1943. She was alive, had raised 4 children and had 7 grandchildren, and had spent her entire life wondering if anyone remembered the kind American woman who had saved her family. "I have pressed roses from that garden in my mother's diary for 80 years, Anna wrote. "I never forgot the woman who taught me that beautiful things could grow anywhere if you planted them with love. Please tell your sister that my mother spoke of Zelda every day for the rest of her life." The letters kept coming. Families from Australia, South Africa, Israel, and across the United States. Children and grandchildren of people Zelda had helped, people who had heard stories their entire lives about the brave woman in Ohio who had risked everything to keep them safe. Some sent photographs of family members who had made it to safety. Others shared documents and memories that helped fill in pieces of the story. Dr. Sarah Kellerman from the Holocaust Memorial Museum spent 2 weeks in Millfield, working with Cordelia to piece together the full scope of what Zelda had accomplished. The final count showed that our grandmother had been part of a network that helped 47 people escape persecution, including 13 children under the age of 12. "What makes this discovery so significant," Dr. Kellerman explained to the reporters gathered in Cordelia's living room, "is not just the number of people involved, but the meticulous care with which these identities were preserved. Zelda Morrison didn't just save lives. She saved the proof of who these people really were, their authentic selves, in case they ever needed it or wanted their descendants to know the truth." Cordelia handled the attention with a grace I didn't know she possessed. The shy librarian who had been rebuilding her life after divorce was suddenly giving interviews to national television programs, speaking at Holocaust remembrance events, and working with genealogists to help families connect with their lost histories. 6 months later, she received the letter that changed her completely. It came from Sydney, Australia, from a man named David Ruth Goldberg. He was Ruth's grandson, named after her father Samuel, who had also stayed with Zelda in 1943. Ruth had lived to be 89, had become a teacher, and had told her children and grandchildren stories about the American woman with the rose garden who had taught her that hope could bloom anywhere. "My grandmother never forgot you," David wrote to Cordelia. "She never forgot your grandmother, I mean. She used to say that Zelda Morrison taught her the most important lesson of her life, that ordinary people doing extraordinary things in quiet ways can change the world. She would have been so proud to know that Zelda's granddaughter was brave enough to share their story." The house on Elm Street became an unofficial pilgrimage site. People traveled from around the world to see the garden where their ancestors had found safety, to touch the soil where hope had been buried and preserved for decades. Cordelia eventually opened the house for tours 2 days a week, sharing the story and helping families understand the network of ordinary Americans who had done extraordinary things during the darkest period in modern history. But it was what happened to Cordelia herself that I found most remarkable. The woman who had been afraid to make decisions, who had spent months grieving the life that had fallen apart around her, discovered that she came from a legacy of incredible courage and moral strength. She found her purpose in ways she never could have imagined. "I understand now why I always felt drawn to helping people find information, to connecting them with the stories they needed," she told me one evening as we sat in Zelda's garden watching the roses bloom. "It's literally in my blood. Zelda spent her life helping people preserve and protect their true identities. I'm just continuing the family business. Today, the Zelda Morrison Foundation provides support for Holocaust education and helps families research their histories during that period. Cordelia never remarried, but she found something better than the life she'd lost. She found the life she was meant to live, rooted in the same soil where her grandmother had planted seeds of hope. 80 years ago, every spring, when the roses bloom, visitors come from around the world to see the garden where love and courage literally took root. And every spring, Cordelia tends those roses knowing that they're growing not just from soil and fertilizer, but from the legacy of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things when the world needed them most. Sometimes the most important stories are buried right beneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig them up and share them with the world.